Welcome to Mid-Century Living, your weekly podcast about everything mid-century and how to bring the mid-century vibe to your everyday life.
Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us on another week living in the mid-century on Mid-Century Living, the show where we talk about the mid-century then and now. We're your hosts, Jackie.
And Gonzalo. So it's been a week since we last talked. What's new?
Well, last week I was talking about possibly rotating my Pyrex to my autumn display, but I didn't end up actually doing that. But what I did instead was rotating my closet out. So I packed away all of my florals and gingham and took out all of my oranges and spooky Halloween prints and plaids. So my closet is ready for fall, even if the weather isn't ready for fall. But I've just decided to turn orange. So that's what I'm going to do.
I have zero orange. I need to get some before Halloween.
Yes. So what's going on with you?
My week was not as interesting, I guess. I actually it was a long week at work. Lots going on, lots of late days. So I really don't have anything new except for the fact that today my rotation of 50 drinks that I have with me at all times also includes coffee, which I am drinking out of my Houston Astros mug. Go Astros. So, Jackie, have you ever traveled by air?
Well, yes, of course I have. I used to do it a lot more when I was younger, and my family traveled a lot for my dad's job. Nowadays, oh goodness. I think the last time I was on a plane was in 2019.
Oh, wow.
It's been a minute. I wonder if it's changed much.
Interesting. I flew. It's all the same. I flew I was going to say a couple of weeks ago. It's been a month and a half now. Over summer, I took a flight to Seattle and back, and it was fun and it was great, and I love flying. And listeners, if you guys remember our Meet the Host episode, I dropped a little bit of knowledge there about flying because I'm a pilot.
He's a pilot.
Unfortunately, not for jet engines. I wish I could fly jet engines, but I do not have that. It's not a license for it, but you kind of have to have permission to fly a jet.
So is it years of training to fly one, or like what's the details? How do you upgrade?
So I hold a private pilot license, which is like the basic general aviation license. But after that, you have your IFR, which is instrument rating, which is what I need to get to be a safer pilot. And then you have your commercial license, so again, commercial certificate, really. And then after that, you have things you can add. So, for example, complex aircraft, which includes planes that have retractable landing gear. You can get your added for jet. And then, of course, if you are a professional pilot, as in is your career, then here's where you would get your license. Or again, sorry, I keep saying license, but it's certificate that lets you fly passengers. I mean, I can fly passengers, but like not like a big jetliner.
So is the technology different,
So,
and there's training involved, or is it really just a matter of filling out forms?
oh no, there's a lot of training involved. Like if I got into a like Boeing 737, I there's so much stuff that I wouldn't be able to do. I could probably figure out the actual flying part if I needed to, because the principles of flight are the same. Like pull back on the yoke to move the airplane nose up and down, flaps help you extend the wing size and all that stuff. All that is the same regardless of what plane you're flying, but I know zero about flying with a retractable gear plane. I never flown a jet engine. I have flown a plane after jump starting it with cables like you would a car
Wow.
battery, which was a little scary. But anyway, listeners, sorry, we went on a tangent there. Obviously, since we are mid-century living, I wanted to start our talk about flights and planes and jet engines with World War II. Because, of course, before World War II, we had planes. Planes were not new to the mid century. But before then, we had more rudimentary propeller planes that weren't really made to carry a lot of people. We started in the 20s and 30s, kind of bringing people into the planes. And of course, during World War II, we have those great Spitfire fighter planes, but passenger travel is still not really a thing. During World War II and post World War II, civilian flying was mostly restricted to the US mail and then military things. And the need for moving mail back and forth led to the development of airplanes, which led to the development of larger airplanes. And they still used propeller driven planes using a radial engine. So if you guys want to know more about radial engines and different kind of engines, let us know, and maybe we'll drop in a bonus episode on the history of flight.
Good idea.
Anyway, so we have, after World War II, we have some planes being made that are more for flying mail and starting to fly passengers. We had things like the Fokker planes, which I'm not cussing. They were called Fokker, Fokker. They were created by a guy named Anthony Fokker, which
Poor guy.
just makes makes me think of Meet the
Yeah,
Parents.
you know.
And actually, one of the first commercial flights I took was on a Fokker, which that sounds so weird.
I bet
saying
that's
it,
really
but, you know.
fun in airplane school or whatever it's called.
Airplane school is fine. We can call it that.
Is it just? I'm just picturing the instructor being very, very serious, and then everyone in the class giggling. But they're all grown adults because they're learning to fly planes. So it's that's what I've pictured.
Yeah. Hey, actually, so when I was training for my IFR, which I never took the test for, that was in an actual academy for flying, and that meant that I had people like me who had been adults already at that point and maybe had careers but were switching. But we also had kids who had just graduated college, or we had kids who just graduated high school, because in order to be a pilot, you just need to be 17.
Wow.
If you want to be a professional, like career pilot, then you need to have a college degree. But
17 is young. I suppose we'll get to it not being any more dangerous than a car, so it shouldn't give me as much pause as it does.
But anyway, guys, we see at this time the beginning of a little company you guys might have heard of called Boeing Company, which to me is even funnier than Fokker because I just think Boeing, Boeing, Boeing. Model 247, which was their first model with a metal skin, used Pratt & Whitney Wasp radial engines. So we're still using propellers towards the end of World War II. And we also started seeing a lot more planes, or many more planes, I should say, with the introduction of the Douglas Aircraft Company and their twin-engined, which means there's two engines, DC-2, which is still propellers. And interestingly enough, so Douglas Aircraft Company merged with another company to form the McDonnell Douglas Corporation, which is responsible for one of the most famous jet planes, the TriStar, which was a 3-engine plane, 2 on the wings, 1 on the tail. And if you guys are ever in an airport and you're driving up to the airport and you see like the FedEx planes, a lot of times you see the TriStar. So if you might have already seen one and never knew about it. And then, of course, also in this time, we have the Martin Marietta Corporation, and we have a Russian plane designer by the name of Igor Sikorsky, and Boeing also starting to produce larger planes, 4-engined flying boats to cross the Atlantic and cross the Pacific. But again, we're still using propellers. And interestingly, also here is when we see the creation of Pan American World Airlines, Pan American World Airways, or Pan Am, which, if you remember from the host episode, one of my dinner party guests is Juan Tripp, who started this. And hopefully we can get an episode on Pan Am by itself, because it is a huge part of the mid-century.
That'd be fun.
And then, of course, we have Boeing with his Stratocruiser, which is probably the ugliest plane ever. I'll try to link a picture to the show notes because this thing was horrid.
Describe it for us.
It looks like a big Tylenol. So I was quoting Airplane, the movie, but also it's accurate because it looks like a pill. It's like literally a cylinder with like a dome on the end. It's not the nose of a plane that we see today.
Interesting.
So 1940s brings us the 377 model, still using propellers. And World War II led us to also focus on building bombers. So We finally arrive at the mid-century, 1940s and 50s. Sorry, listeners, I had to get a little bit of history down before we could talk. But 1940s, 1950s saw the creation of the pressurized cabin. Now, airplanes, you've been in an airplane before, you've gone through the safety spiel at the beginning with the oxygen masks and all that stuff. That's because planes are pressurized, meaning that they have pressurized air inside them. They're pushing oxygen into the plane so that you could fly at higher altitudes. If you fly above certain altitude, you start getting into air that does not have oxygen in it, and you can suffer from things like hypoxia, which is the lack of oxygen in the blood. And that's no bueno because that's what causes you to pass out.
Huh.
So if you ever in a plane and those things drop from the compartment above you, please make sure to put one on. Breathe normally. The back may not inflate. And always remember to put your mask on first and then help others.
No, that's adorable that you have it memorized. Is so the planes you fly are tiny little guys. Do they have
Mhm.
oxygen emergency guys too?
No, so I don't go high enough to require oxygen.
Huh.
There's very specific altitudes that by law you're required to have oxygen after I believe above 12,000 feet. You have to have oxygen for the pilot and the crew for at least if you're going to be flying there for over 30 minutes. But the highest I've ever flown was 9,000.
Fascinating.
But in the 1940s and 50s, here's where we get the introduction of the turboprop engine. So that means we are getting so close to the jets. Turboprops are powered turbines. Unlike the jet turbine, which provides thrust through the rearward discharge of hot exhaust, meaning that the hot exhaust goes through the turbine and comes out the end at the back. The turboprop operates by the turbine rotating a shaft connected to the combustion chamber and the propeller. So it still drives the propeller to give the plane thrust. And we have the creation of possibly my favorite airplane, which is the Douglas DC 6, which are starting to provide steady passenger service worldwide. And both produced up until 1958. Both pressurized, both still turboprop, so again, still using propellers. And an estimated time flight from New York to London in these planes would be about 15 hours at about 20,000 feet, which unfortunately meant that they could not avoid bad weather. And travel was very lavish. Men donned coats and ties, ladies hats and dresses. By 1958, what's important is that most people, at least most US based passengers, are choosing to fly to Europe rather than take the ocean liner. And that brings us to the actual jet airplane. But yes, the first commercial jet that had, and I say jet because I can finally say it, plane that had a jet engine was the de Havilland Comet in 1952. And yes, the prototype first flew in 1949, but 1952 is when we start seeing the de Havilland Comet being used. Very unique design, very beautiful design. I really wish we could do this with planes nowadays because the de Havilland Comet had a jet engine that was buried in the, call it the armpit of the plane, really, the part where the wing meets the fuselage, which is the body of the plane. So it kind of blended into the wings and it looked really cool. And it had two on either side. And it flew roughly 50% faster than a turboprop. So we're starting to see the jet engine cutting the world in half, really, as far as time to get around. Really tragic plane because flying so high gave us a lot of different problems. Unfortunately, the Comet met its end due to a design in the window. This is where we see the the plane windows now, which are not square, because they create a structural issue. You guys may have heard, if anybody here is into flying, you may have seen the shows on Discovery Channel or National Geographic, the ones about plane crashes. Um, there's a very famous Comet flight, the BOAC Flight 781, which was a scheduled flight operated by British Overseas Airways Corporation from Singapore to London, and it crashed on January 10th, 1954, because of explosive decompression due to that misdesign on the windows. Anyway, guys, the unfortunate end of the Havilland Comet led way to the Boeing company to create the 707, which really is the beginning of the 7 by 7 series, which is what we know as planes today. 737, 747, 767, they're all part of the 7 by 7 series. And the Boeing 707 was based on the prototype named 36780, which was credited as the first jet plane for Boeing. And 707 we know as the plane that set off the jet age, which is the mid-century flying time. And it dominated the air until the 1960s, powered by 4 Pratt & Whitney JT3C turbojet engines. And it was introduced by Pan Am in 1958. So Pan Am is a huge part of the mid-century flying. With over 1,707s built between 58 and 78 for civilian use, although many of those planes make their way to the military. And in fact, production of the 707 remained open until 1991 for military use. So that is, I can't do math in my head, but a lot of years. But of course, 707 and the jet age brings up these great images of people flying, enjoying flights, always dressed up. Jackie, I don't know if you have anything on that.
They call this time period the golden age of air travel, and I'm sure that they do that mainly because of how glamorous it was, but mostly because of how luxurious it was. So you kind of touched on this a little, where your options were either to fly or to take a luxury liner, a la the Titanic. They were actually competing with each other at this time, so air travel had to market itself as a luxury transportation option. So boy did they. I mean, they were eating lobster and prime rib off real china. Tickets were like $1,000 adjusted for inflation for a
Wow.
domestic flight. $3,000 today's equivalent to like go to Europe. Um, it was not cheap, so it was a luxury expense, and you treated it like a luxury event. Women were dressed in their finest, coats, gloves, hats. Men, a shirt and tie and jacket were expected. Like, you dressed for this as an event, and they treated you like royalty. But also, even the crew wore designer uniforms. Dior and Chanel actually designed the uniforms for Air France and Olympic Airways. I mean, the whole thing was a spectacle. Um,
Wait, hold on. So if you were flight crew, does that mean that you received Dior
yep, for Air
as part of your
France,
like uniform?
your uniform, the official uniforms for Air
Wow.
France were designed by Christian Dior. And Coco Chanel did the Olympic Airways uniform. So it was a very
Wow.
big deal. Everyone was fancy and beautiful. They didn't put as many people on the plane, so they had a lot of extra space, and they even had fashion shows as on air entertainment. They tested having 2 floors where, like, you go up to the dinner car and you sit at a table for dinner, but for takeoff and landing, you're down in your seat. Like, they tried a lot of different stuff that sounds a lot like luxury trains and luxury ships. The experience was totally different than what it is now. But things did get more
I want
casual.
that.
I know, I want that too. If anything, I just want the bigger seats. So things did get more casual as travel got cheaper. Once it became more accessible, it wasn't as much of a luxury experience anymore, so people dressed down slightly. But people still looked nice to go out. They pretty much, as long as society was in the way that you would dress up to go shopping, you would dress up to go flying. Once you stopped doing that, you kind of stopped everywhere. I have heard, though, that if you do put an effort in, I mean, you don't have to wear a cocktail dress and pumps to the airport, but if you do make an attempt to look nice, you're a lot more likely these days to get upgraded to first class.
Yes. Okay. So I have experience with that because I always like to dress up a little bit. Like I'm not wearing a suit and tie often when I fly, but I also think that it's a disservice to social life to wear pajama bottoms and flip flops on the plane. Like that's too casual. Keep that for the bedroom, in my opinion. But when I was in college, I took a design course which was giving us a project in San Francisco, which is not this city where I went to college. So we had to fly there. And my friends and I thought it would be great to dress up as like professional people. So we wore our suits with tie and everything to the airport. And we actually had a limo waiting for us in San Francisco, courtesy of one of the guys in my class who was a driver for limos. But that meant that when we got to the crowded security gate at the airport here, we were dressed up, and TSA saw me and my three other friends who were dressed up and waved us over to a shorter line, and we got to cut the entire line of security. And we
That is
go in. We
awesome.
still went through security and still went through like all the necessary X-ray machines and stuff, but we didn't have to wait in line.
See, that's awesome. Your classiness was rewarded.
Hmm.
Also, it's just nice for the crew to see someone putting an effort in. I'm sure it's not great for their self-esteem either when they get all dressed up in their uniforms and go to work and then everyone shows up in their pajamas, and that's got to be disheartening also.
Yes, I always make it a point to be nice to the crew, and I always thank the pilots, and I make a very special point to thank the flight attendants, because flight attendants' job is not to serve you. The flight attendant's job is to keep you safe. They do all the serving stuff as extra.
That is cool. So those are my thoughts on flying fancy then and now, I suppose.
Thank you for that. So we kind of already brought today into flying with our personal stories, but jet engines are such a big part of the mid-century, spreading into today. The 737, which let's face it, is one of, if not the most popular Boeing 7x7 series plane, still uses a modified version of the 707 fuselage and external nose. So what you see in those planes is very similar to what the 707 was. The cockpit, which is the little room in the front where the pilot sits, also has a very similar configuration to the 707. The 757 uses the 707 fuselage cross section, meaning that the circular shape and size of the 757 is the same as the 707. And of course, like I teased earlier, the jet engine makes way for the turbofan engine, which is what we see today in all modern commercial jetliners. So it's possible that if we had not created the jet engine, we wouldn't have the turbofan, but also our preferred way of travel across the world might still be ocean liners or even zeppelins, which were a thing in the 30s. And the jet engine, guys, it's not just reserved for planes. Chrysler decided to create a jet powered car. And the reason was that jet engine in a vehicle, in a car, could use many fuels. It requires less maintenance and it lasts longer than the conventional piston engines, which is what you see in your cars today. It just was a little bit too expensive to produce. But the Chrysler turbine car, which was an experimental two-door hardtop coupe powered by a turbine engine made between 1963 and 1964, was an actual thing that happened, a turbine-powered car. And about 50 were created for a public user program, which was Chrysler's attempt at seeing how the public responded to it. All are copper orange, which is a very beautiful color. And if you guys are ever up in Auburn Hills, Michigan, I recommend going to the Walter P. Chrysler Museum, which I think is open to the public. I went there because I have a friend that works for Chrysler. I think it's open. I'm not sure. But I got to go see the turbine car.
Cool.
Yeah, it ended, unfortunately, because it was very hard to pass government emissions regulations. So, and still today, back to the plain jet engine, we are constantly working to improve it. Again, not we, because I'm not an engineer, but we as in people are constantly working to improve it. We have aerospace engineers looking for ways to make it better in order to reduce emissions, make them greener. I mean, engines have grown. We went from small piston engines to the radial engine to the turboprop to the jet engine. now the turbofan, and we have people all the way up to NASA researching, constantly getting ways to make the jet engine core smaller. Because if you make the core smaller, you change how the air flows through it with a goal to increase fuel efficiency and reduce the aircraft's or the aviation industry's impact on the environment, which I think is important thing to do.
Yeah, that's great.
So that kind of brings us to the end of how we have jet engines today. The jet engine made flying not necessarily possible because it happened before, but it made it the most popular and safest mode of transportation. So I wanted to share a couple of statistics for you guys on flying today. So the number of international arrivals per year has increased 56 times since 1950, which means that for every one person that was flying in 1950 internationally, we have 56 people flying today.
Wow.
That means that there could be around 500,000 people in the air at any moment. So right now, where we're recording, and right now when you are listening, there could be around 500,000 people up in the air above you.
That's trippy.
The USA's FAA Air Traffic Organization, which provides service to the US airspace, provides service to more than 45,000 flights and 2.9 million airline passengers every day. And that is in the US.
Wow.
So, jet wise, the US aircraft inventory is estimated at over 7,600 commercial aircraft, all jets.
That is amazing. And we've come all that way in quite a bit of time, but that is some exponential growth if I've ever heard it.
I know, and it's really interesting. And I know that we're not a technical podcast, and there's many podcasts and many things to listen to that explain better by more knowledgeable people about the jet engine. But it's such a huge tech advance that came out of the 1950s. Mid-century living is still impacting us today.
That's great. Thank you so much for walking us through all of that. I feel like we learned a whole lot. But since you've landed the plane by landing the theme of this episode, I think that means it's time to segue into our etiquette segment, which we are going to make an official thing. So I found this week's etiquette tip from my Betty Crocker's Hostess Cookbook. I have the 1967 edition. It's a second printing. For you Mad Men fans, Betty Draper had a copy of this cookbook propped up in her kitchen, in her Auchenang kitchen, in the first couple of seasons. Thus, she had a first edition, obviously, because mine was printed in 1967. But that may or may not be why I own this, because I'm trying to buy everything that Betty had in her kitchen. But anyway, so my etiquette tip is how to invite guests to a party. So, according to Betty Crocker, the way that you invite guests to a party indicates what kind of party they should expect. So if you're having a formal event or a significant occasion like a bridal dinner or an anniversary, you're supposed to do written invitations and you're supposed to send them out 2 to 3 weeks in advance. But if you're having an informal dinner party, you make those invitations on the telephone 10 days to 2 weeks in advance. If you are calling all of your guests, you're supposed to try to call all of them on the same day so that no one feels like they're an afterthought, which is a nice touch.
That's cool.
Right? I thought that was a good thing to put in there. Also, the guests half of the etiquette in this situation is that if you are invited on the phone, you should decline or accept right away, right then on the phone conversation. And if it's by mail, then it should be no more than a day or two after receiving your invitation in the mail. So, what do you think? Is this how we should continue to invite people to parties?
I am 100% behind it. The only thing I would like to change from this etiquette is the guest expectation, because I am that person who will say yes immediately and then immediately regret it. So if the expectation of the guest by phone is to answer immediately, I'm going to have a panic attack.
She did mention a little. I worked this down from a whole paragraph in the cookbook intro, but it did say that you could say something on the phone like, well, my mother-in-law's coming into town that weekend and she hasn't given us a specific day yet, so we might be available that Saturday or we might not. And then the host could choose to respond with, well, just let me know as soon as you know, and you could make some kind of tentative plan in that way. So she did leave some kind of buffer for wiggle room.
Okay, that's good.
But apparently the proper etiquette as far as this is concerned is if someone calls to invite you to a dinner party, you're supposed to open your calendar while she's on the phone
Ah,
and
okay.
figure out if you're available that night or not.
Okay.
So I think we should judge the etiquette tip as written. So how do you feel about it as written?
You know what? I will be favorable. So count my vote as yes.
I agree. I think that these are not unreasonable requests. And I also love the idea that formal invitation means formal event, informal phone call means informal event. I think that's pretty cool. So I also vote yes on keeping this etiquette tip.
Perfect. All right. So it looks like we are giving it the mid-century living stamp of approval. And with that, listeners, I think we've reached the end of our episode today. So I wanted to take a moment to thank you guys for listening. And if you have any questions or comments about today's topic, send us an email at info.mcliving@gmail.com.
Sounds good. Don't forget to follow us on Instagram at MCL Podcast and subscribe, tell your friends, and leave a review.
So, listeners, we'll see you next week.
Bye. Thank you for listening to Mid-Century Living. Please subscribe, tell your friends, and leave a review. We're available on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts. You can also follow us on Instagram at MCL Podcast. See you next Friday.